Welcome back to The Cellar. Todd Orr was a 50-year-old man from Bozeman, Montana. Bozeman is a city located in southern Montana in the Rocky Mountains. It was October 1st, 2016, and Todd woke up early at 4 a.m. Todd was heading on a trip into the wilderness on this day, one he had made numerous times over the course of his lifetime spent in the outdoors. For him, this day was like any other. He woke up, got dressed, grabbed something quick for breakfast, and hopped into his pickup truck with his handgun tucked safely in his chest holster. In the pickup truck, Todd already had his backpack loaded with all the gear he would need for the trip. He started the engine and set off on an hour-long trip. He would soon arrive at the trailhead with about an hour left until daylight. He would double-check his gear and head off onto the trail before him. This particular trip for Todd was a scouting expedition for elk. The area where Todd was hiking today was Bear Creek, which is located in the Madison Range, a section of the Rockies that runs between West Yellowstone and Bozeman. The trail ahead of Todd was pure, untouched, and thick forest. This particular trip Todd was making would help determine whether the area would be a good one for him to hunt in the upcoming weeks. Todd was an avid outdoorsman with decades of experience. In 1990, he completed a degree in fish and wildlife management at Montana State University, and to put it as simply as possible, Todd knew what he was doing whenever he trekked into the wilderness. One could say he felt most alive and at home when he was out there enjoying the peace and tranquility of nature. Todd made his trek on the path ahead. As he made it around an hour into his hike, daylight was beginning to illuminate the landscape before him. That's when he encountered a large, female grizzly bear walking with her 2 cubs. They were making their way down the trail and heading in the direction that Todd was coming from. In that moment, Todd froze and made eye contact with the bear, and in an instant the mama bear and her cubs were heading off into the woods away from Todd. He waited a couple of minutes to give her and her cubs plenty of time to exit the area, and he continued walking in the opposite direction that she had ran off in. He had only continued on for about a minute prior before hearing a rustle of branches and a snapping of twigs. In an instant, he saw that the bear had left her cubs and was now barreling straight at him. This over 400-pound animal was moving straight at him, and he only had mere seconds to react. He reached for the bear spray that he kept on him and proceeded to blast the spray straight at the animal just before it plowed into him. He turned his body at the last moment and dropped to the ground to protect himself as the animal made contact with him at full speed and mass. The bear stood on top of him and proceeded to bite his right arm and shoulder around 6 or so times. Just as quickly as that all occurred, the bear began to cough from the spray that Todd had hit the animal with, and the bear disappeared back into the wilderness. At this point, Todd had numerous puncture wounds to his arm and shoulder and was bleeding quite profusely, but in looking himself over, he realized he had not sustained any life-threatening injuries. He quickly began backtracking in the direction of his truck. He had made about 5 minutes of progress before he once again heard the distinct snapping of twigs and branches. The bear was back and was not happy whatsoever. The animal slammed into Todd from behind and bit down on his left forearm, tearing away 2 tendons and breaking the bone. The bear continued clawing and now shaking Todd around in a fury. Todd knew all he could do in this moment was try and keep still and not react to the unbelievable pain the bear was inflicting upon him. The animal would bite him around 30 times and slammed and shook him around continuously. If you've ever seen the movie The Revenant, where Leonardo DiCaprio is attacked by the bear, just imagine that scene taking place. The bear continued inflicting pain on Todd, and when it would do so, it would stop and wait for any kind of sign that he was still alive. In what felt like an eternity, the bear bit Todd once more, and time seemed to freeze. The quiet was deafening in its own right, as Todd laid there hoping for the attack to be over with. When he finally got the guts to roll over and look around, he realized he was now, finally, alone in the woods again. He did what he could to collect himself and his things, including his handgun, which had been thrown away from him in the attack, and he proceeded to attempt the hour-long hike out of the woods. Miraculously, at 8 a.m., Todd would finally locate the safety of his vehicle, but he now had a 45-minute trip ahead of him to the hospital. He did what he could to tend to his wounds before setting off. At the hospital, it would take numerous doctors to stitch up his seemingly unending wounds. Even more amazing is that 8 hours later, he would end up walking out of the hospital and driving himself home, although he did have to come back the next day for surgery to fix the broken bone, the severed tendons, muscles, and nerves. The surgeries would end up going successfully, and 6 weeks after the attack, Todd and a friend of his would make their way back to the scene of the crime. As bad as the attack was and how close he came to dying on that fateful day, his love of the wilderness was something he never wanted to give up on. It's reported that Todd still hunts in that area, but he does so in the daylight and prefers to go when there is snow on the ground. That way he can see the paw prints before he chances another encounter with one of nature's most fierce apex predators. I want to give a ton of credit to Chris Bennett, who wrote an amazing article about this particular story. His breakdown of the entire thing was extremely in-depth and helped me outline and tell the story myself. If you're interested in reading his extremely well-written article on the story, I will link it in the description box below. Matthew Allen was an 18-year-old boy from Sydney, Australia. It's reported that Matthew suffers from some sort of mental illness, which is believed to have played a large hand in the events that occurred back on November 27, 2012. On this day, Matthew left his home with little more than the clothes on his back and a small amount of food. He would leave his cell phone in his bedroom and head out into the Australian bush on a survival mission of sorts. Now, what actually transpired while Matthew was out in the wilderness is not completely known, but Matthew's mother would immediately contact police after he was found missing, and a search would be underway. The police launched numerous helicopters and rescue dogs into the surrounding bushland, but after weeks of extensive searches, no evidence of Matthew was found. The more time went by, the more it seemed apparent that Matthew had most likely succumbed to the harsh and unforgiving bushland. To add to it all, it is believed that searchers may have gotten close to finding Matthew a handful of times, but Matthew was actively avoiding people and wanted to be left alone. During the time frame he was missing, Australia would go through a record-breaking heat wave that led to numerous wildfires throughout the country. After 2 months had passed, it seemed hopeless that Matthew would be found alive, but his family never gave up hope that they would be able to bring their child home. That brings us to Saturday, January 26, 2013. 2 hikers were making their way through the bushland not far from where Matthew had gone missing. As they made their way through the harsh terrain, they would make an unbelievable discovery. They spotted a disoriented man lying on the ground. This man was none other than Matthew Allen. After 9 weeks out there alone, Matthew was found emaciated and covered from head to toe in leeches. Mosquito bites marked the skin all over his body, and his feet and lower legs were suffering from a terrible case of gangrene. Rescue workers were contacted and would use a helicopter to winch the man out of the woods and straight to a nearby hospital. When he arrived, it was determined that he was badly dehydrated and had lost around 50% of his prior weight. He was also suffering from partial blindness. It's ultimately believed that if Matthew had been left out there for even a day or 2 more, he most likely would have succumbed to a horrible fate. Not a lot is known about how Matthew managed to survive for as long as he did, but police believe he had been exposed to the elements the entire time he was missing. Matthew had no shelter of any kind, and he survived purely on the small amount of food he had brought with him and water he had located from an almost completely dried out creek bed. At the end of the day, with little to no survival training, Matthew's story of survival is one of extraordinary luck and determination. Matthew would end up making a full recovery, and his family vowed to make sure he got the mental help he needed moving forward. Lindy Harding was a 21-year-old student at Hull University at the time of the story I am telling here today. Hull University is located in Kingston upon Hull, a city in the East Riding of Yorkshire, England. Lindy had a passion for chemistry and would later graduate and become a teacher. In 1999, Lindy's mother would pass away in her sleep from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, otherwise known as sudden death syndrome. Lindy and her family were absolutely shattered by the sudden death. In the aftermath of her mother's death, Lindy was looking for a distraction from the pain and heartache. This is when she would seek out the Hull University Parachute Club. From the very beginning, she knew skydiving was the exhilarating thing she needed in her life. She made her first jump from 3,500 feet over the Humber Bridge in Hull. She was quoted as saying, "I was so excited. I'd never been in a plane before, let alone jumped from one. I loved it as much as I thought I would." This newfound passion would result in Lindy looking to make jumps as often as she could. She would complete a total of 10 jumps over the next couple of years, but this number would have been much greater if it wasn't for bad weather often canceling her attempts. This led to the club organizing a trip for 7 to California in April of 2001. The trip to California could not have started off any better. The weather was beautiful, the sun was constantly shining, and Lindy completed 4 jumps. The trip was everything she had hoped for upon making the journey across the globe. This leads us to Lindy's 5th jump of the trip. Just like all her jumps prior, Lindy checked her parachute and prepared to board the plane. As they took to the sky, Lindy sat eagerly waiting. The plane would make its way to the designated altitude, and those on board prepared themselves for the trip back down to Earth. It was now Lindy's turn to go, and the okay was given. Lindy jumped out of the plane like she had 14 times prior. The adrenaline of soaring through the air at upwards of 70 miles per hour is like nothing else. As Lindy completed her descent, she would pull the cord on her parachute. Nothing happened. She then deployed her reserve parachute. But to her absolute horror, the main chute would deploy with the reserve, and they both would get tangled up in one another, making both redundant. Lindy would continue hurtling towards the ground for another 40 seconds, moving at upwards of 70 miles per hour. The parachutes would slow her descent slightly, but not enough to stop her from plummeting straight into the earth below. Lindy had plummeted a mile through the air to the ground below. What she went through should have been enough to end her life. But miraculously, Lindy would wake up 8 days later in a hospital bed with her father and sister sitting by her side. She had absolutely no recollection of what had happened, where she was, or how she had gotten there. The most amazing aspect of this story is that Lindy had only suffered 2 fractured ribs, a punctured lung, a broken nose, and a chipped tooth. Doctors ultimately believed that she had passed out prior to hitting the ground, and the relaxed state her body was in may have been the difference between life and death. 3 weeks later, Lindy would make the trip back home to the UK, and 7 days after arriving home, she would go back to school. She was determined to get on with her life and live it to the fullest. Although she only displayed minor injuries, the road to recovery was not an easy one by any stretch of the imagination. She suffered short-term memory loss for a long time and was in a constant state of pain. But she continued to push forward, and in 2002 she would graduate. In November of 2004, she would meet her future husband Paul, and prior to getting married a few years later, she would tackle her fears and go skydiving once more. Lindy believed that before she got married, she needed to make another jump or she would regret it for the rest of her life. So she boarded a plane and successfully made a tandem jump just a couple months prior to her wedding. Lindy would say that after completing this jump, she felt like she could finally put the accident behind her and start her new and true beginning of life. Thank you all for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow. Also, you can check the description box below and find the link to my merch store. Tons of awesome designs, and the proceeds help fund the channel. I also just started a new membership tier for the channel. It's $2.99 a month and comes with some pretty cool perks. So if that interests any of you, then please go ahead and check it out. Also, if you'd like to submit a real-life scary story that you would like featured on an episode on the channel, please do so using the email linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything you do to support the channel is greatly appreciated. Until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.